Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Star Wars Universe podcast. Today we are doing a primer on Grand Admiral Thrawn. If you've been following The Mandalorian this season, you've been introduced to characters like Ashoka Tano and Katan, and just recently mentioned Grand Admiral Thrawn. Maybe you're a big fan of the Clone Wars, or the TV show Rebels, or some of the novels, so you know these characters well. But it's quite possible for many fans they haven't heard of them before. Or maybe you saw them some years ago, you don't remember. This is going to be the first of a couple of primer episodes in which we dive into those characters and tell you all the stuff about them that's interesting, and especially all the stuff that's relevant for where things may go with them on the TV show Mandalorian and in other Star Wars content hopefully soon to come. So, with all that, we're going to have that conversation today with Riki Hayashi, specifically on the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Right after this commercial break, we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew. I'm your host. As I said, I'm joined today by Riki Hayashi. Riki, what was your reaction when, in that last episode, all we have is that one line from Ahsoka saying, "Where is your master? Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn?" What was your reaction when you heard those words?
So our usual co-host, Sarah, is not here, but she could attest to this if she were, that I started doing the little kid dance. Where your feet just like pitter patter. I was sitting down, but I was like, "Oh my god, she said it!" And then I got in the chat, and I think I just said like, "Ah."
Yeah, and I knew exactly what you're talking about because I was in a live watch with some friends that we do every Friday night for Mandalorian, and I just like filled the screen with like E and exclamation points.
Yeah, and then,
he has long been one of my favorite characters. Since the original books, and I knew we were going to get Ahsoka. I'd heard rumors about Bo-Katan. Both of those are awesome, but I went absolutely crazy when I heard that Thrawn is back.
Yeah, and last week, when you covered the episode, I think you had 3 co-hosts, and they were all very lukewarm, ranging from, I don't know who that is, to, like, I'm kind of familiar. And
right.
that was part of the reason I asked for you to do this special episode, because I was like, no, they did not geek out enough.
I think it's so well put, and I'm so glad you suggested it. I think it's a great idea, and as I said, we're going to do it with Thrawn. We're also going to do another one with Ahsoka, and with everything we know about the Mandalorians and their world from those TV shows. I find myself here in the opposite position that I've often been in, because, for example, with the MCU, I have loved the movies, I've loved the TV shows, but I hadn't read many of the comic books. And so often I would see the movies, I'd see the TV shows, and then I'd start go digging and say, okay, well, I want to know what's the backstory of this character? What are the Easter eggs referring to? What are all those things that I might not be getting? And I think it's a difficult thing when a movie or a TV show introduces a character from a less well-known part of the canon or even a non-canon thing. Because then there's all the question of, like, people like you and I might go crazy about it. What does everybody else think? And I think so far they've done a great job of that. But I know I've heard from so many people who want to know more. So that's what I'm really excited about today, is that we can dive in and know more about that.
I'm pretty big on comics as well, Marvel and DC. So, like, for example, at the end of Days of Future Past, in the post-credits scene, they show Apocalypse as a teaser for the next movie, right? And, like, the people are chanting En Sava Nur, which is his real name, and they show the 4 horsemen on the horizon. And I got real excited in that post-credit moment. And then, of course, I watched the movie X-Men Apocalypse, and all of that excitement went away.
Yeah. And it's funny, I think a lot of times I am going to have that same bit of nervousness. And I feel like if we had just had Thrawn introduced in a different episode, I might have been resistant to doing this episode. Because I would have been worried, like, well, but what if they do Thrawn totally different? Or what if we don't really get him? Or what if it's just something that's very disappointing? I have to be honest, part of why I feel so confident going into this is because they got Ashoka Tano so perfect. I was so impressed by Rosario Dawson as Ashoka Tano. I felt like that was the character brought to life, such a good rendition of her, that it just gave me a lot more hope in general about, okay, I don't know what they're going to do with Thrawn. I don't know what they're going to do with some of the other Mandalorian stuff and things like that. but I'm at least hopeful enough and excited to see where it goes.
Well, and it helps that this episode, The Jedi, was written and directed by Dave Filoni, right?
Yeah.
And he's the one responsible for previously bringing Thrawn to Star Wars, the cartoon Rebels, which we will talk about. And of course, he also did Clone Wars with Ahsoka. So this is a caretaker who is familiar with the characters already.
Yeah, definitely.
And is continuing their story rather than trying to adapt a story that someone else has previously done.
Definitely. And in this case, Thrawn is not his original character. He's a character created by Timothy Zahn in novels, and we'll definitely talk about that. But a character who Dave Filoni has already brought to life in, as you said, Star Wars Rebels. So let's just start with the very beginning. What is it about General Thrawn that has us so excited? What is it that makes you love this character so much and geek out so much when you heard that name?
I mean, broadly speaking, this goes back to when I guested on superhero ethics. We were talking about villains, right? The ethics of villains and how it's a more compelling story if you have a villain that is relatable and possibly someone you even agree with on some aspects. And I think, to me, that's what Thrawn is in the Star Wars universe. You use the phrase mustache twirler with regards to badly written villains, especially Palpatine, who he is portrayed in a great way. Ian McDiarmid does a fantastic job in the live action as Palpatine, but his character makes no sense. Like, his motivations are questionable, and he just cackles for cackle's sake.
He just wants ultimate power.
Yeah.
There's no motivation.
Unlimited power.
Better. Exactly. Yeah.
But Thrawn is, I mean, I'll say it, in those books that we're going to talk about, I was kind of rooting for him in some ways, even though he was the villain.
Yeah. I think that's very well put, and I think it's in part because he is, and one thing I'll say from the beginning is, when you dive into the larger Star Wars world, the question of what becomes canon comes up a lot, and is argued about a lot. Officially right now, there are two different Star Wars universes. There is what's called the official Star Wars canon, which is all of the movies, all of the TV shows, and then select novels that have been written and officially approved by Disney Star Wars in recent years. Then there's also the Star Wars Legends canon. And Legends is all of the books that were written before the Disney takeover, and which Disney then declared pretty much complete that they were all not canon, but has been then over time selectively bringing things from those books into this current canon. And those books were not necessarily the first ones, but the ones that really helped kick them off were a series of 3 books called the Heir to the Empire series, written by Timothy Zahn, in which this character of Grand Admiral Thrawn is introduced. And so we're going to be referencing stuff from both of those because I think the stuff that happens in those novels isn't necessarily officially canon, although Zahn has now written some canon novels about Thrawn, which are very similar in many ways. But that I think we can talk about both because they both shape the character. And so in terms of those novels, I had a very similar reaction to you, especially because it is the first time where we see someone talk about why they think the Empire actually is good for the universe, for the galaxy. And it's interesting because the situation that's taking place in those books is kind of like what's happening in the TV show The Mandalorian. This new group of people, the former rebels, are trying to establish power. They're trying to establish a republic, and they're having a lot of trouble. And there's a lot of corruption, and there's a lot of places where authority hasn't been established, and a lot of things where no one knows how anything's supposed to work. And so a lot of local warlords are taking over, and there are people who think, I want order again. I want something established again. And as you said, that's what Thrawn's position is. Thrawn is, I want the Empire because it will lead to that. And later we get another set of motivations for it that are also encouraging, or also relatable. But even just from that, I think I had the same reaction for you. He was such an interesting character. He was so compelling. He had he was very funny, if nothing else. A very dry, sardonic wit. And he made me really care about what the Empire was going to do in a way I never thought I would.
And he's also visually stunning. Although he's originally from a novel, they have a description of him, and then they use that description as a basis for everything from comic books to video games, and now, the cartoon Rebels, and soon, hopefully, we'll see a live-action version of him. Right. So the Grand Admiral is the highest rank achievable in the Imperial Navy, and they wear a white uniform instead of the usual gray naval uniforms, and it's just very visually striking, also because he's an alien, and he has blue skin and red eyes. So just like that color scheme, it has always made him very visually compelling as well.
Definitely. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things about him to start with is he's not a human. And in the Legends canon, they really establish that the Emperor himself and the Empire itself is pretty racist. And the fact that Thrawn is an admiral as a non-human, as an alien, is very out of character. And that part of the reason why he wasn't part of the Galactic Civil War, what we know of as the original 3 movies, is because even though he was a Grand Admiral, he wasn't really trusted, so he was sent to the Outer Rim, things like that. In the canon, I don't think it's ever been explicitly said in the movies or TV shows. It might have been in a book, but it's never been explicitly said that the Empire is racist and humans only. But certainly it's been shown. I don't think we've ever seen we've probably seen 1 or 2 non-humans wearing Imperial uniforms, although I'm having trouble remembering them. But we certainly have never seen them in a position of power. So him being an alien is, and what he's gone through because of that, the discrimination he's faced within the Empire, is one thing that makes his character really interesting.
I don't think we've seen anyone. So part of this is kind of like the quirk of old movies. I feel like, when A New Hope came out, they just had the actors that they had, and it was 1977. Right. So it was just a bunch of, white British guys. But then that kind of became the character of the Empire as the movies continued. They continued that. I don't think in the original trilogy there is an Imperial who is not a white male, right?
I think it's correct, yeah.
And then in the post-quels, I know that there was an Asian character on one of the bridges. Of course, Captain Phasma is a woman, and then we see that the stormtroopers are black. So there's an expansion there, but still, even in the post-quels, I believe they are all still humans.
Yeah, I think that's the case, and in The Mandalorian as well, and in Star Wars Rebels. I'm pretty sure that's also true. Again, that's why I'm saying there may well have been one that I'm forgetting, but certainly it's overwhelmingly true.
Yeah, and so when the canon novels, the Legends novels came out, they used that as a template to just explicitly say that the Empire was very human supremacist and human focused. And yeah, so Grand Admiral Thrawn really stands out there. Not only that he exists at all, but that he achieves, I believe there's only 12 individuals who achieve the rank of Grand Admiral.
Yeah. It is definitely it's a very, very small rank, and the fact that he acquires that is very, very important for him.
So let's talk about why he achieved this rank. What makes him so great, Matthew?
I think the best way to describe Thrawn is he is a strategic mastermind. And I think a big part of that is because he is so fundamentally different than most of the Imperial leaders we've seen, especially the Emperor and Vader, but also even some of their top admirals, in that he is not filled with hubris the way so many of them are. A lot of times there's this sense of, we have the overwhelming firepower, these rebels are nothing. He always starts from a place of fundamentally respecting his enemy and often admiring his enemy, and wanting to learn as much about his enemy as he can in order to get inside their heads and try to figure out what they're doing. And in the first 3 books, this is presented in what I think is an interesting way of showing it for the character, even though if you dig kind of deep, it doesn't make that much sense, but it sort of symbolizes the larger idea, which is that he studies art. And so often there'll be scenes in those books, and also in the Clone Wars TV shows, where you see him looking at the art of a particular culture and then saying, okay, well, this particular culture does not deal with surprise well at all. So if we launch this kind of attack that uses a technique that they don't believe is possible, then we'll completely paralyze them with fear, or something else against a different culture. And it feels like it's and I know you have a specific concern about it that I'll let you talk about in a second. It feels like it's kind of a stand-in for a much, much larger discussion of studying a culture to study its military tactics. So it definitely is to me, I think this is what makes him so powerful, is that he respects his enemy. He does not overdo his own hubris, and he learns as much about them in order to, in order to figure out what they're going to do and thus defeat them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that the art thing actually makes no sense whatsoever, in that when he uses it to stereotype an entire species, that's just nonsense. Like, you can't look at a Picasso painting and then figure out how a human general who, has nothing to do with Pablo Picasso would act. Right. Because not all humans are going to act that way. Pablo Picasso himself was a huge outlier, right? And how he created art and how he viewed the world.
There's one particular scene in the books that I think makes much more sense in this regard, where he, because of spies, he knows the exact layout of the offices of the different, rebel officers. And he looks at the art that a specific actually, I believe it's Admiral Akbar, what specific art that person has hung in his office. And there, at least, I think, okay, that makes a little more sense in terms of the connections you can draw. But you're right. The idea that, the art of an entire species, an entire planet, is going to tell them something. I like the idea it's pointing to, but that particular example, it doesn't hold as much water as it did when I was 13 and read it the first time.
Yeah. And it's even more interesting, I think, in Rebels, when he gets some art that the Rebel character Sabine has created. Because she's a tagger. She does graffiti. So he has actual examples of her art and is able to use that to understand her rather than, all Mandalorians, which she is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a much better way of thinking of it. And so even moving aside that specific example of it, what is your take on what makes him such a great strategic genius?
Well, you said I agree with you about respecting the opponent. Mm-hmm. He also respects his own troops, the people under him, and he values their lives, which is very different from how other Imperials act. You said the whole Imperial philosophy is just to use overwhelming numbers, and that often means just sacrificing troops to overwhelm your enemy. The TIE fighter is the classic example of this, that it has no shields, it has no hyperdrive, and, it takes one shot and blows up. It's very flimsy. Right. In the Rebels cartoon, Thrawn is actually overseeing a project called the TIE Defender Project to create an improved TIE fighter that has shields and has hyperdrive and can basically, on a one-on-one basis, compete with or even beat an X-Wing fighter. So in that sense, he's not only trying to achieve technological superiority on the opponent, but also just putting value in the lives of his own pilots and saying, I want you to have the best tools possible to defeat the enemy, rather than just seeing you as cannon fodder. And that, I think, that leads to his fleet performing better for him, because that creates a bond, I think, between the Admiral and his troops.
Very much so. And in those original books, one of the things that they postulate is the idea that one of the things that kept the Empire all fighting so well together originally was the Force. It was the Emperor using the Force to some extent, really kind of artificially give them morale and but also a little bit enslave, not quite enslave them, but kind of direct them. And that without that, the Empire falls apart. And and I think you're right that the books really make clear, and I think that moment with the rebuilt TIE fighter really drives home. He cares about the morale, and that changes so the people under him are so aware of that, and that makes them eager to fight and excited to fight for him.
Yeah, the thing about the Emperor was interesting. It almost feels Borg-like, to borrow from Star Trek, that it created like a emotional force bond between troops that helped them to coordinate better, I think is how it was described. And yeah, so when the Emperor dies, that's the explanation given for why, because there was still, like a fleet of 20 Star Destroyers that was overwhelming the Rebel fleet. Like, why did they panic and scatter? Because they had lost that force connection between each other. And they didn't even know it.
One of my favorite moments from those early books is, because again, it's really there to show the difference between him and someone like Vader or the Emperor. Is in the first two books, there are two instances where he has given a direct order to a subordinate, someone in the someone on the bridge crew of his ship, the Star Destroyer, the Chimera, and they fail. And it's a situation where it's very clear, and the author says, the point of view character for all this stuff with Thrawn is his friend and subordinate, General Pelion, or Captain Pelion, I'm sorry. And he's someone who remembers what it was like under Vader. And so he talks about how different this feels than it was under Vader because, when Vader would see someone make a mistake, just, you're dead. Think of all the people he kills in Empire and how afraid of everyone is. With Thrawn, with someone who makes a mistake, he goes and he questions them. And when he realizes it's because the person, did something wrong because they didn't think enough about it, he has them killed. And so he's certainly very strict in that regard. But when a person makes very clear that they were thinking it through, that they were using their brain, but that the computer couldn't do the thing that he wanted it to do, in a situation where Vader would have almost certainly killed the person, the Emperor definitely would have, Thrawn doesn't. And I remember the specific line in the novel at that point is something along the lines of, at that moment I knew Thrawn had the crew in a way Vader never did. And that to me was such a striking image. And I think you're right. We haven't seen that exact same thing in Rebels or in any of the newer novels, but it's definitely that same idea of he respects the people who are not only he's fighting against, but he's fighting with, and that earns him their respect. And it gives them morale in a way that they didn't really have, I think. And I don't know to what extent we've seen that or not, but I think if he is brought into the show, The Mandalorian, that could be very interesting, because so far it seems like, think of those soldiers who were the ones who kidnapped, we now know, Grogu, Baby Yoda, at the end of Season 1. They didn't care about the Empire. They were just, workaday guys trying to not get killed by Moff Gideon. I'd be very interested to see Thrawn come along and maybe bring people more together.
But let's be real. Admiral Thrawn would have killed Admiral Ozzel at the beginning of Empire, right? Because that guy was just kind of bumbling.
What is it? He brought his ships out of light speed too close to the
planet, to Hoth.
Yeah.
Which in itself doesn't make much sense.
You're as clumsy as you are stupid.
But yeah, I do agree. That was a very powerful scene. I think it was the tractor beam operator who Luke's TIE fighter escaped because he used some special signal scrambling thing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, he was I thought I had it, but I didn't, and he got away. And Thrawn lets him live, and he says, your special project now is to figure out how to defeat this thing that they used against us.
Yeah.
And he uses it as a teaching moment, right?
Right. And I think even when he does kill the other subordinate, because you talked about would he kill Ozzel, I think you're right, he would have. But with Vader, so often it seems he does those things out of anger, very much the dark side. Certainly Kylo Ren does it, out of just, toddler smashing his toys. Thrawn is ice cold. Yeah. Thrawn is cold and calculating, and I'm going to kill you because I believe that it will be better for everybody else if you die and they see that you die. It's not, you failed and I'm mad and I'm going to take my anger out by killing you. And I think it's much scarier in some ways, but it's also much more effective in terms of leading troops.
Well, that's debatable. I don't think you should kill anybody if you're leading troops.
But I mean, acting out of strategy rather than acting
Yeah.
out of anger, even
On
if
the
the strategy is bloodthirsty and terrible.
On the spectrum of villains, he is
Yeah.
the least.
Well, and certainly it's that I think I mean, the flip side is I think he's very ruthless. Like, he is very willing to act out of, to do whatever he deems as necessary in a situation, but it's not cruel. It doesn't feel malicious the way so much of the rest of the Empire does.
Yeah, so we talked about, like the TIE Defender and why he developed that weapon. I think he would have been completely opposed to the Death Star, right? Because that makes no sense. Right. Why are you blowing up an entire planet to make all the other planets afraid? Like, if you keep doing that, you're going to run out of planets. And the Star Destroyers can already blow up cities. So right. I think that's enough. If you come to a planet and you blow up, like, a city, I think they'll get the message.
Yeah, it's one thing that the Legends book go into a lot, is that a lot of the generals, a lot of the people in the military didn't like the Death Star project because they saw it as, exactly right, it's overkill, it's way too vulnerable, and it's concentrating the power entirely in the Emperor's hands.
I mean, yeah, I guess that's the point. Or in Tarkin's hands, right? It was Tarkin's pet project, and he basically used it as his own political springboard. Right. And in the Legends canon, after it blows up, they call it Tarkin's Folly.
Oh yeah, I remember that. One other thing I think that's also really important to name about Thrawn, it doesn't come up in those original 3 books, but it has now come up in both the later books in the Legends canon, but also I believe, and I think you know more about this than I do, in the new canon books, is the idea that his race is what are called the Chiss, and they come from the space outside of the known galaxy, what they call, beyond the outer rim. Yeah. Wild space, I think it's called.
I think it's the unknown regions. There might be the unknown regions and then wild space, which is like, what? I don't know.
We've never seen a map for this, certainly. But yeah, it's way, way out there. But the point is that his race faces some, galactic level threat that he thinks he's going to need the rest of the galaxy to work with in order to fight this, and that he believes that the Empire is the only thing that has the authority to marshal enough power and military to fight that fight. So that, I think, also helps make him, even though that's not introduced in those original books, and I think hasn't really been mentioned in the Clone Wars yet, knowing that from the other things also helps make him even more relatable, because it's not just that he wants power for power's sake. He believes that there is some great danger out there, and that you need one strong military authority that can fight it.
Yeah, this was the Yuzan Vong War, which spans a lot of novels. I haven't read them all, but this extra galactic threat from outside the galaxy is actually used as a justification, I believe, for Palpatine's whole scheme. Mm-hmm. That he was not only trying to take over the Republic in the known galaxy, but was also trying to militarize the forces of the galaxy to meet this threat, because the old Republic just didn't have a strong enough military. It was too decentralized to do that.
And I think that's not canon, am I correct? Because that certainly would fundamentally change the idea of Palpatine as the mustache twirler. I think that's why it's kind of buried in 1 or 2 novels, but hasn't really been pulled out into many other things yet.
Right. It was mentioned in Legends, and even that, it's not. I don't know. Like with anything with Palpatine, I don't know if you can trust it all. Mm-hmm. But that's what was presented, and it goes so far as to Thrawn in Legends, Thrawn was exiled from the galaxy. And that's why he wasn't around for the Galactic Civil War with the rebels. And the reason they give is that he actually was pretending to be exiled. Basically, the Emperor pretended to exile him to go prepare the Chiss more for to be the vanguard against the Yuzan Vong.
Right. And there's a version of it also in which the Chiss don't believe in the threat, and so he's been exiled by them. There's a lot of different reasons for it, and I'm not sure what they're going to introduce in this particular version of the story, this most official canon. But certainly I'm very excited to see it be... I hope that they give us something for him, that it's not just that he believes in power for power's sake. As I said, it may well be that he believes in authority because he just sees the New Republic as too weak. But I'd love it if they gave us some version of that. He believes in this greater threat.
And that's very possible given what happens to his character at the end of Rebels.
Definitely. We'll get there in a bit. So let's just talk about the history more. I think in terms of those Timothy Zahn books and some of the ones that come after, well, first of all, in the original 3 Timothy Zahn books, he does die at the end of the 3rd one.
Yeah.
And everything else up to that point is... Most of the other books are then written as prequels or other things like that. But I think it's important to know what those books are because, again, they're not in the canon, but if they're taking parts from it, it might be interesting because they are basically set at the time that The Mandalorian is taking place. They're supposed to be, I believe, 5 to 7 years after the Battle of Endor, when the New Republic is getting back on its feet, trying to rebuild itself. And in the books, Thrawn basically tries to rebuild the Empire and comes very close to succeeding, until he is finally defeated, in part by Jedi shenanigans and everything going well and all sorts of good things like that. But is there any other kind of key things you think from those books or from the other Legends books that are important to know about who he is and how he how that are important to know about his character?
So after the trilogy, Timothy Zahn actually wrote 2 more books further in the future of that timeline, where Thrawn has a secret base out in the Outer Rim or possibly the Unknown Regions, where he has a clone of himself. This was the Hand of Thrawn dyad, I think they're called. It's 2 books, not a trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
Or duology? I don't know.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I did not read those, but I know about them.
Wow.
You'd probably know more.
I mean, it was Thrawn, so I was like instantly hooked.
Yeah.
And also they brought back Mara Jade.
Yeah. And cloning, I will say, is a very important thing to the character in those Legends books, as well as because one of the things that he does is he uses clone soldiers. Now, those books were written before the prequels, and so they take a very different version of the clones than is now official in canon, so that he may well not go in this direction. But I think one of the things that is most interesting, and that this, I think, may well play into if Thrawn has a role in The Mandalorian at some point, Thrawn is very knowledgeable about the role that the Jedi played and that Force users played in battle. And that, as he said, that the Empire needs someone with the Force. You want to talk a little bit about what Thrawn does in that regard in those books?
Oh, I mean, he recruits a dark Jedi, or actually a clone of a Jedi who went mad and falls to the dark side. And uses that Jedi to kind of replicate what the Emperor gave to the troops, as we discussed earlier. That extra level of hive-mindedness. He also discovers an animal that is able to suppress or like push back on the Force. Mm-hmm. They're called it's like a weird name. Eel Salamiri.
Yeah, Il Salam. I keep wanting to call them the Isalami, which is not true, but it's Isalarami, I think is the correct pronunciation.
And these animals just like create a natural bubble around them where the Force has no effect.
Right.
So he uses this in combat, attaching them to like the stormtroopers on using, puts these animals on backpacks basically. And then the stormtroopers run around and like it messes up Luke and other Force sensitive people that they fight against because they can't use the Force in that area. And then he also uses them to accelerate the cloning process, I believe. So that part we might not see because the clones themselves are already different, and the Jango Fett clones seem to already be able to be accelerated, have accelerated growth. But
yeah, because in the books, the idea is that accelerated growth, as well as the fact that they're clones, and thus they're not part of the living force in the way normal living beings are. There's something is missing, and they're not able to kind of be fully capable, and that the Emperor's force control allows them to do that.
Yeah, but somehow like growing them in this force bubble using these animals was able to help smooth that process out.
Right.
But
and you pointed out something I hadn't noticed, which is that although we've never heard those animals mentioned, that there was a painting of one of them in his office at some point in the TV show Star Wars Rebels, right?
Yeah, like I didn't know that. I just found that picture and I was like, oh, holy crap.
Yeah.
So that may just be an Easter egg. They're just like, just draw this in the background. It's fine. Like hardcore fans will get it. Or it could be a hint that he has already found these animals and may use them in the future.
Yeah, which would be pretty darn cool.
Yeah.
Because again, it introduces such this interesting new dynamic to all the stuff about the Force. That maybe there is this possibility of pushing it back in some way. And I think especially the fact that we know that he is a character who, at least in those original books, was so interested in using the powers of the Force. I don't think that's coincidental. We'll get more to this in a second, but I'm thinking that may tie in some way to Moff Gideon clearly wanting to do something with the Force with Baby Yoda Grogu. So, and we'll get to that in a second.
And possibly clones, right? Like,
yeah,
because they had like test subjects in those cylinders that seemed like it could be a clone-like process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. So let's talk about his role in Rebels, because while I like the novels are very interesting for what he might do, we do have him established as a real character in the TV show Star Wars Rebels, which I will just give a quick plug for. You probably have heard myself and Riki, along with Riki's partner Sarah, doing episode-by-episode reviews of the Clone Wars. The TV show Clone Wars, I think, has a lot of greatness in it. It also has a lot of, kid stuff or other stuff to kind of wade through. Rebels is, the best way I can put it is it's Dave Filoni has much more to do with it than George Lucas does. And it is I think in a lot of ways, a much tighter show and a much more well-developed show. And it's in those last two seasons of that show that Thrawn appears. So, Riki, tell us somewhat about Thrawn and his role in Star Wars Rebels.
Well, I thought first off, the voice actor that they get is fantastic.
Lars Mikkelsen.
Lars Mikkelsen, who is the brother of I'm blanking on his name.
Mads Mikkelsen, I think it is.
Yes, yeah,
but
Mads.
Who played the father of Jyn Erso.
Yeah, Galen Erso.
Galen Erso, yeah, the
Rogue
designer
One.
of the Death Star.
And obviously, like, they would have nothing to do with each other in Star Wars. But I'm saying if they get Lars to continue portraying the character when he's brought to live action, the way that they did with Bo-Katan and Katie Sackhoff, I think it would be fantastic. Like, he knows the character, he's got a great voice, and I think he actually looks fairly like him too. I mean, the way he's been drawn in cartoons and stuff. So first off, I just wanted to say that, and I hope that he's under consideration and that they bring him on board.
For anyone who's wondering, you would have seen him as Stregobor in The Witcher, and in a very different kind of role, but he was also Victor Petrov in the recent House of Cards.
Oh, yeah, he was.
Yeah.
You mean Vladimir Putin, right?
Yes, basically, for all intents and purposes.
Basically.
But yeah, so go ahead. Go tell us more about what he does in Clones.
So Rebels.
Star Wars Rebels,
Yeah. Rebels is a show that takes place like maybe 1 or 2 years before the Battle of Yavin, and kind of deals with the establishment of the Rebel Alliance. Like, at this point, they aren't an alliance yet. They're just kind of like a loose band, a fleet of rebels, right. And they haven't really made the political connections, and they're just kind of a thorn in the side of the Empire in this one sector. And they are a thorn. They, they do a lot of good work against the Empire. And then Thrawn is brought in by the Emperor to clean things up. And I think in the last 2 seasons, he is the main nemesis for the rebels.
That's correct. Yeah, last 2.
And he has, I mentioned, the TIE Defender project, and he also comes in contact with, because there are Jedi in this series, he comes into contact with the Jedi, and as you said, he has an understanding of the Force. He believes in it, unlike some of the other Imperial characters that we've come across. And I think, as is his way, I think he has a respect for it and a desire to understand it and to be able to defeat it. So that could be an avenue of how we are introduced to the Il Salamiri animals. That he goes out, he's like, I lost to a Jedi, like I have to find out how to defeat them, type of thing. Like that seems very in character with what he would do after being defeated, which he is.
One important note on that. This isn't shown in the Clone Wars, although I think it's briefly mentioned as an aside at one point. But in the novels that are written now in this canonical world, he spends time with Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker is actually part of originally introducing him to Chancellor and then Emperor Palpatine. And then later he spends time with Darth Vader. And there's an interesting couple of scenes in which it becomes pretty clear that Thrawn recognizes, who Darth Vader originally was. So just one more kind of cool part of like his awareness of the Force and the role that it's playing in the Empire as it's growing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think is really essential there is that, as you said, he really respects the rebels in a way no one else has. I think in the first 2 seasons, you're right, the rebels really are this ragtag bunch, but they're becoming more organized. Like they meet up with, Senator Organa. They meet up with some of the other people we get to know in the movies. And none of the Empire really takes them seriously. They're just sort of like this annoyance, a fly to be swatted. By the time Thrawn comes in, I think he really takes them seriously as a real threat to be dealt with. And so it's really fun watching him because until now our heroes have just been running rings around the Empire because they just can outthink them all the time. Thrawn gets them into traps. Thrawn throws them back on their heels. And it's really fun seeing this kind of chess match that starts developing with both of these sides really playing 4 or 5 moves, 6 moves ahead.
Yeah, he kicks them off. He tracks them back to their home base, which was hidden,
right,
and basically kicks them off it. So he delivers a defeat to them as well.
Yeah,
pretty significant one. But like I said, at the end of the series, and spoilers here, but we're talking about something that's a couple of years old. So skip ahead if you plan on watching Rebels. I do recommend it.
Mm-hmm.
But Thrawn is defeated in the final battle in a strange and dramatic way when Ezra Bridger, the Jedi trainee character on the series, summons some space whale squids.
Yeah.
And they can fly through space and live in space and have their own hyperdrive, like natural hyperdrive. That's how they get around.
Yeah, they can fly in hyperspace, which is often presented as kind of like it's not just a speed, it's like a different dimension or a different part of the universe in some way.
So at the end of the series, these whale squids show up, wrap their tentacles, because that's the squid part, around Thrawn and his ship, which Ezra is on, and then they hyperdrive, hyperfart away.
Yeah.
And disappear. And that's it. And the other characters, like, we defeated Thrawn, but we lost Ezra, and it's kind of like a bittersweet victory. And that's the last we see of both of those characters until now. Or at least, hear of them. Where
it all ties in, because what's the last thing we hear Ahsoka say before she shows up in this? Do you remember?
She was searching for Ezra. I think both her and Sabine, the Mandalorian character, go off together, maybe?
Yeah.
Searching for Ezra.
They basically say, and this is the implication that we're given is that most of the people in Star Wars Rebels, because as you said, it all takes place before the Galactic Civil War really kicks off. We get to see some great moments. We get to see Mon Mothma leave the Senate and become part of the Rebel Alliance. Like, it's great for like backstory of the Star Wars movies. And then at the very end, it flash forwards to the end of the Galactic Civil War, after the Battle of Endor. And it's not really made clear. I think Ashoka Tano, the idea was that she was kind of off doing something else, and that's why she wasn't really part of the war. And it's a little hand-wavy, but, I think it's better explained in some of the novels. But Ashoka Tano specifically says that she's now going to dedicate herself to hunting for Ezra Bridger. Ezra was really the main character of the Star Wars Rebels show. And as you said, he disappears with Grand Admiral Thrawn. And so to me, the fact that Ahsoka says, "Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn?" that to me opens a lot of doors, because it could well be she's just interested in him because he's back and he's fighting, another part of rebuilding the Empire in some way. That could be a great direction for it to go. But it could also be that she's looking for Thrawn because she thinks Thrawn is the key to finding Ezra Bridger. Yeah. And I don't have any idea where that would... At that point, I feel like the story would have... The Mandalorian would be such a side character in his own show that would have to just be its own spin-off show. But, the plot doors that all this opens up are just so interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I saw a tweet that basically said the same thing, that the Mandalorian is just a side character on this show, because now, like, with Gideon and Ahsoka and Thrawn opening up the possibility of an Ezra Bridger return, it's like, wait, why do we need the Mandalorian anymore? Well, what's his job in all this?
And that's why I think I do hope that I hope it's referenced, but I do hope that that at least part of the story becomes more of, if we really go in that Ezra Bridger direction, it becomes more of a spin-off show. Although I will say, I had this thought earlier, I think in some ways Mandalorian is the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of this story, which for those of you who know Hamlet, or especially the, I think it's David Mamet, play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Those two are side characters in Hamlet, but in this other show that Mamet wrote, I think fans read into me and tell me if I'm wrong there.
Tom Stoppard.
Tom Stoppard, thank
unfortunately.
you. I didn't think Mamet was right. The idea is that the whole play is them watching the events of Hamlet, but through their perspective. So I would I hope that The Mandalorian keeps being its own story, but I also think it might be kind of fun to basically have major galactic events, but all told by, he's just doing his own thing. He's doing bounties, and every now and then, just through his eyes, we get a picture of what's happening in this much larger story.
Yeah, like he shows up, and then Grief Karga is like, "Mando, did you hear that they finally defeated Grand Admiral Thrawn?" And he's like, "Yeah, great. Do you have any macarons for the kid?"
Exactly. Which, by the way, further proving how awesome Dave Filoni is, Dave Filoni went on Binging with Babish. It's a fun YouTube cooking show. And together they made the official recipe for the macarons that schoolyard bully Grogu steals from that other student.
Oh, well, no, I know what we're making for Christmas.
Yeah, I'm excited to try and make those. So let's talk about some other ways in which Thrawn might well be a part of things in The Mandalorian. Certainly I think it could be that Ahsoka's looking for him to find Ezra. What do you think are other reasons why either Ahsoka could be looking for him, or why he might be being introduced into this story?
Because he's evil. I mean... Yeah, I mean, he's not as evil, as we said, as others, but he's still a villain. He's still a part of the Empire. No matter what we think of him, he does bad, tyrannical things. So I think he's the big boss behind Moff Gideon in all of this.
That's a real possibility.
We're not going to see him yet, like in season 2.
Oh yeah, I think that's correct.
I think there might be like a finale of season 2 kind of like Thanos reveal, right? Where he just like walks up at the end and shows up, like a chair spins around and he's sitting in it or something.
Oh, that'd be so good.
But I think this is, at least season 2 is going to be the Gideon story, and it might even be like a lot of season 3 is Gideon. Yeah. And then Thrawn is being set up as kind of like the second half of the series villain.
Yeah. Thrawn might be the second half of the series. I think he might even be, it might just be that we only hear him referenced, but that if Ahsoka gets her own series, or there was something published today that said Rosario Dawson had been signed for 3 new movies. I have no idea how accurate that is. We know that there's so many rumors that run around, so no one put bets on that. But it may well be that Thrawn shows up, like there's another movie about him in some way.
Oh, wow.
Right? Like, geek moment for real. I think he may be Moff Gideon's superior. I think it would also be interesting if going with... I kind of like the idea that we don't yet have an established empire yet. We have a whole bunch of these little people trying to put the pieces together. And maybe Moff Gideon and Thrawn are kind of rivals at this point.
Oh, sure.
Especially since, I mean, again, we've had often this... A Moff often has military power, but is more of a political leader than a military leader.
Yeah. Moff basically translates to a governor.
Right.
A space governor, in this case, not of a state, but of a planet.
Right.
And then I think a Grand Moff is responsible for a sector of planets. So yeah, definitely political, but they do have control of the military forces on their planet, oftentimes. Mm-hmm. And then the Grand Admiral would I would expect that to usually supersede that authority. Mm-hmm. But in a post Endor empire, everything's in chaos. I think both in Legends and in canon, it's established that all of these warlords, ex-Moffs and admirals, just try to carve out their own little slice of the galaxy and hope they get left alone.
Right. And certainly it feels like, I hope that Mandalorian isn't going to be how the First Order came to be. I don't want this to be the First Order creation story, but I think we are going to see the seeds that are planted that eventually lead to the First Order. And so certainly people from the Empire playing around with cloning and the Force, like knowing where this goes to in terms of Snoke and then Palpatine, Palpatine 2 Electric Boogaloo, it feels like it is not coincidence that we're playing around in those waters that eventually those two characters come out of. And it might be that Gideon and Thrawn are on the same page. It might be that one of them wants clones, whereas the other one just wants to mainline the Force himself. We don't know. But I just think there's so many interesting possibilities there.
So, yeah, I think, how many more years is it until the First Order after this? Another decade?
So,
at least?
I don't believe it has ever been officially said, but from the things that I've picked up and from, I've read a lot of these, Star Wars timelines, and the general belief is that Mandalorian happens about 7 to 10 years after the Battle of Endor.
Right.
And that Force Awakens happens 30 years after the Battle of Endor. Oh, yeah.
So we're not even close.
Yeah, we've got a long way to go. But certainly it is also known that the First Order develops in in the, what was it we call it? It's not wild space, but the unknown
region.
Right. That's where Exegol is. The planet that Palpatine is on at the end of the Rise of Skywalker movie.
Yeah, I'm just gonna chuckle at that.
I know. I'm making no editorial comments about that today. I've made them at other points. You can go listen at some point. But yeah, so again, that could be a connection. The fact that Thrawn comes from that world, comes from that part of space, or at least they're both from way beyond the Outer Rim. There again, there could be some interesting connections. What I think, we don't know. There's so much the Mandalorian story still to tell. If nothing else, we clearly need to have Boba Fett come back, and that's going to be a whole other story. Plus, the Mandalorian has
Right?
now had this whole reveal about that everything he thought that he knew about Mandalorians may well be wrong, and that he's part of just this one offshoot sect. He's not actually practicing the way as practiced by most Mandalorians. So I think most of the story of this show is going to stay on that direction. But I imagine that we're going to get like little references to Thrawn thrown in for the next couple of seasons. And like you said, maybe the end of this season or next season, that just Thanos-style post-credits reveal of, the man in blue turning around to look at us.
So if we are to have a connection to the First Order, I would want a Captain Phasma connection. Because that was a character.
Give her a real character that's interesting?
Yeah, because that was a character that was visually stunning, and like you just like want to know more, and we didn't get anything.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I guess it was kind of like Boba Fett in the original trilogy.
Yeah.
And
and at least with not necessarily with Boba Fett in the original, but in the postquels, you had a real quality actress playing Captain Phasma, who again got just criminally underused.
Yeah. So maybe, I mean, given the timeline, I guess it would be a very, very young Phasma, maybe even just like starting out. But like, what if she is on Thrawn's crew and he's the one that trains her?
Oh, I could see that. That'd be pretty cool. Or she could be, I mean, we might meet her as some just like person hanging around one of the planets they go to. But, she sees like how terrible things are because of the New Republic. And so she wants to go join the Empire. And like through her, we get to see why people are interested in this First Order thing. Because they're so upset about what the New Republic is trying to do. We've already created with this idea of, the New Republic starting to push out into the Outer Rim and not doing very well. This idea that people are not happy with it. So, yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. But it'd be a great way to maybe plant the seeds of where Captain Phasma comes from.
Well, yes. I mean, she's responsible for the new Stormtrooper program, right? Which is basically just mind control, brainwashing.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's basically the like child soldiers. It's you're kidnapping children when they're 1 or 2 years old and just raising them without names, without identities, just to be, Trooper X9 F9 6257. What heck ever it is.
2187. FN 2187.
Oh, okay, cool. I was just making up numbers after the FN.
Reflex.
Well done.
But so, okay, like talking about this out loud, Phasma with that program, the Stormtrooper program, there could be connections with what we've been talking about with Thrawn in terms of like his use of clones, and then what Gideon is doing with the Force and or possibly clones and infusing them with the Force.
Yeah.
So these could be like offshoots of similar, kind of super soldier-esque programs.
Definitely. So I don't want to just go on too long. And so I did post, though, in the Stranded Panda group, and I got some great responses about people who haven't seen the Clone Wars and Rebels wanting to ask questions. One thing that a lot of people have asked for is us to put together a primer of like good episodes to watch to know more about Thrawn. We're also later going to do one of these primers. I think early next week we'll record one on Ahsoka and the Battle for Mandalore and all that stuff. I'm going to see if I can put one together, and Riki, I might ask for some of your input on that. I think also there are some other good ones online already, and so I might look at those. But just a couple of questions that were asked when I posted online. Nathaniel Muzzy asks that if we have the time, a comparison between Thrawn Classic and New Thrawn. And I think what he means there is Legends Thrawn and canon Thrawn. What do you think are some of the differences you've seen? Or we've talked a lot about similarities for sure. Are there major differences you've seen?
I thought so, and I had actually wanted to mention this, so it's a great question. I think Legends Thrawn from the books was like I said, a much more relatable character, I guess, or admirable. It's tough to say that about a villain, but we've had this conversation. I think he was a character that I at least personally wished that there could have been a way that instead of fighting against the New Republic, like he could have joined with them, especially in light of the revelation of the Yuuzhan Vong. and kind of uniting the galaxy in a different way. The Thrawn in canon, especially in Rebels, was less so that. I think he was much more of a villain in that and presented that way. More classic Imperial, but less, bumbling and less murdery evil, I guess.
Not the malicious cruelty.
Yeah. But still much more of a villain, I think, than that he came across in the books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true. Is not quite as relatable, and certainly we see him being... He has that respect for his enemies, and it's... A number of years ago, there was an ad that was made with a number of British actors who have played villains, and I remember Tom Hiddleston was in it, and I believe... I'm having trouble remembering who else was in it, but the whole idea was about how audiences, especially American audiences, love villains played by British men. And British men, I can't do the accent at all, but who were able to sort of, discuss utter cruelty with that very clipped, very proper British accent.
Yeah, and, Tarkin.
Say again? Yeah, Tarkin's a great example of that. Loki's a great example of that. And Lars is Danish, but he certainly is able to do an accent that sounds very European. I think fairly, somewhat British, but maybe a little more European.
Yeah.
But it's this very sort of cold, restrained... Oh, Ezra Bridger, I'm just going to have to wipe out your planet if you don't tell us what we need to know. Again, I'm not trying to...
So he did that in Rebels, right? Like, he basically raised Lothal to the ground to get to the Rebels.
Yeah. His thing is, he doesn't do it out of anger, but he will do it. It's a sort of sense of, I don't want to slaughter people for no reason, but slaughtering people in order to get one person to tell me something is in his mind a justifiable reason. So, which is awful and terrifying in and of itself. It's just a different kind of thing.
But I don't know that Legends Thrawn would have done that.
I think that's fair.
Because I think Legends Thrawn would have seen the planet Lothal as much more of a resource that he didn't want to waste in order to get to the Rebels. Like, that was not a cost I think he would have been willing to take.
Yeah, certainly one thing he talks about in the books a lot, I think you're right, he doesn't talk as much about in the new Thrawn, is he often doesn't want to destroy a planet's resources, and he also doesn't want to destroy the planet's morale. In that, and I think he talks openly that he thinks this was a mistake of the Emperor, that if you rule through fear, you're like, if you bombard a planet, now that planet doesn't give you resources as a colony the way he would want it. And B, now you make the people angry and you're always fighting them. So I think, that's a great point, that Book Thrawn seemed a little more focused in that direction.
That was definitely a scene, where they show up at a planet to subjugate them, and Captain Pelion is basically like, should we open fire? He's like, no, like, then we don't get any of the resources.
Right. Yeah, and he specifically designs a plan so that to avoid the planetary bombardment that he doesn't want to have to do.
Yeah.
Just looking to see if there's other questions. We have a couple other people talking about Thrawn.
I have a question
they are about it.
for you, Matthew.
Go for it.
Other than, because we talked about Lars, other than Lars Mikkelsen, can you think of anyone else that you might be interested in playing this character?
I can, and actually, this was another thread in that group, so I want to just give some of their answers as well. But to start with for myself, I think Oscar Isaacs could be very good at it. The guy who played...
Poe?
No, that's not who I'm thinking about.
Oh.
The person who played Lucius Malfoy and the captain the first season in Discovery. Jason Isaacs. It's Jason Isaacs is the person I'm thinking of.
All right.
He, I think, could be a very good choice. Purple Man is very different, but he has that still, like, just very incredible menace within genteelness. David Tennant, I think, could be very good at it. Other folks I'm thinking of would probably be too old. Who else would you think of?
I'm stuck on this Lars Mikkelsen thing, especially because I saw pictures of them side by side, and I was like, oh, he's Thrawn.
Yeah.
Good, we're done.
He really is. He does look very much like the drawing of him.
I mean, they probably, like, in the cartoon, they probably drew him similar, right? On purpose.
Yeah, I mean, they often do try to do that.
Yeah.
So, Looking at the thread that was in the Stranded Panda group, which, by the way, if no one else is in it, I definitely recommend. One person suggested Benedict Cumberbatch, who I think could actually be very good, but given all the stuff he's doing with Doctor Strange and trying to not get... I believe I've heard him say that though he loves the MCU, he doesn't want to get into too many franchises. Nathaniel Muzzy suggests Benicio del Toro if he hadn't already been in Last Jedi. Someone else suggested David Tennant. That's good. Here's one idea, and I'm wondering what you think of this. Someone, I know who this person is, not someone. Dylan Diggs, regular part of the Stranded Panda Network, suggests it would be a very different physical characterization of him. But what about Peter Dinklage?
Ooh.
He's very short, obviously, but and Thrawn has until now been portrayed as quite tall, but I don't think that's essential to the character. And they've made some changes, like for example, Ashoka Tano, her head tails are significantly shorter. I think in large part because having an actress work with those prosthetics and do combat would be just ridiculous. I think Peter Dinklage, who for anyone who doesn't know who we're talking about, he played Tyrion Lannister most famously in the Game of Thrones. I think he could be a very interesting choice.
Yeah, I mean, I loved him as Trask in X-Men Days of Future Past.
He was very good at that.
And had a similar kind of cold, calculating villain aspect to him.
Yeah, I mean, as Tyrion, he definitely has a very hedonistic side, which is very much not Thrawn. But yeah, he could be an interesting choice. I think, though, I'm just going to keep coming back to Lars Mikkelsen. That's who I'd want more than anybody. I think you're right. That is just... his voice, to me, is now... I went back, actually, soon after I first saw the character appear in Rebels. I went back and reread the Heir to the Empire books and found I was hearing...
You heard his voice.
Yeah, I was hearing his voice as Lars Mikkelsen's. So, who knows? It may well be... I mean, I do want to be honest. I think it's entirely possible we never see this character appear in live action. That he just gets referenced.
Don't you say that. Come on.
I don't want to get fans, more excited than they need to be. I want it to happen, but...
That would be the worst tease possibly ever.
Well, I think maybe one of the ways to happen is if we can get people super psyched up about it. Because you're right. If a bunch of people just hear the name and are like, no big deal. But if we can get people super excited about it and telling Star Wars they're super excited about it, maybe we can get them into one of the movies or into The Mandalorian. Because I think they had to know how excited people would be when they dropped that name. So, we'll see.
Yeah, so if you're listening to this, write to us and let us know who you think or who you would want to see portray Grand Admiral Thrawn in the live action. Definitely.
And I'll say more about how you can write into us and other things you can write into us about. But before I do that, Riki, any last comments you have or things you want to add?
Yeah, I think what I want to add is that I also want Captain Pelion. That was a character who was very prominent in the novels, almost always at Thrawn's side. Didn't appear in Rebels. And I would just really love to have that character. He's the captain of his flagship and is just kind of like an old man, right? He's like grandpa. It was a very different kind of Imperial, I felt, as was Thrawn.
Yeah, he's kind of a third way in that we have the Emperor and Vader who are like, wahaha, power. Thrawn, who is power, is good because it brings order and we need order to fight this enemy. Pelion is someone who just believes in the Empire because that's what he's been taught all his life. He grew up in the Empire. I think his family was in the military. It wasn't talked about in the books, but if we backdate that, it would have been Clone Wars military. And in the books, he comes across as a very relatable character and just, you do things a proper way. And there are things that should be done. And the rebels are wrong because they don't understand. And you get the sense that he's never asked the questions that Thrawn has in that same way. He's never really wondered, do we need the Empire and why? It's just the idea that you might not need the Empire is too terrifying for him. And that makes a very different kind of evil character, but still an evil character.
I don't even think he's evil.
How so? I guess I'd say a different kind of villain is maybe a better way of saying it. Because I feel like he's very much a villain who believes he's the good guy.
I mean, the way he's written, he kind of is the good guy. So what ends up happening is after Thrawn, he continues as I think he's promoted to Admiral at some point, and he ends up taking over one of the largest Imperial remnants because everyone else just fights themselves to death, and he's like the most senior person who still survives. And I believe that he brokers a final peace treaty with the New Republic, and then after the Yuzan Vong War, there's like an additional galactic civil war, and I think he becomes the head of state of the new empire or new republic or whatever the new government is.
Oh, cool.
In the far future. So he kind of crosses over, not necessarily switches sides, but he's like the most centrist, I guess, of the Imperials, and is able to, I think he has a core morality to him, and even perhaps a kindness that is not evident in other Imperials. And we talk about how how Thrawn was a relatable villain. I think Pelion is even more so in that I don't think he's a villain per se. He works for the villain, but I don't think he's a villainous character.
I guess for me he's a different kind of villain, and it's because I feel like he's the one I see most often in our own world, because the way I see him is, this is not the language that's used in the books he's in, but to put it into the context of the current canon, he is someone who was there before the Emperor came to power. He was probably part of the Republic military. And then when the Emperor took over and said the Republic is becoming the Empire because of the Jedi plot, that's what he believed. And he has just been a dutiful servant in the military while the government has changed, and he hasn't asked questions because the military is not supposed to question the civilian leadership. It's just supposed to do what the civilian leadership tells it to. And so you're right. He doesn't have the investment in he's certainly not a mustache twirler. He's definitely not let's conquer these people. Let's kill people we don't need to. But he is the person in authority who doesn't ask the questions that I think a person in authority should. And it sounds like later in the books he does. But certainly in those first books, the way I do see him as a villain is because he's never willing to say, wait a minute, am I still fighting for the ideals that I signed up for 40 years ago when I joined the military? Is this still a cause worth fighting for? Or, is it okay to just keep believing in it because it's what I've always believed? And it's a very different kind of villainous, but I do think that an awful lot of damage is done by people like that. And so I guess that's why I see him as, and you're right, I think the most relatable of all of them, but still villainous.
Well, I'm going to do a deep dive after this and possibly read some additional novels.
Sounds good.
And come back to you with my thesis.
Let's do it. Let's do another episode on Pelion at a later point. I think that'd be awesome.
Yeah, we'll just pre-record one in the hopes that they introduce him.
Yeah. And I will say that I think elements of the Heir to the Empire story will definitely be brought about at some later point. There are major parts of the story that simply would not fit in canon. If nothing else, this is all supposed to be the great final battle against the Empire, and we've been told in canon that by the time of the Mandalorian, that already happened at the Battle of Jakku. There's also a lot of stuff in those books of Luke trying to train young Jedi, and starting with Han and Leia's kids, but in the books they're twins. So you could fudge the details, but definitely they wouldn't fit exactly. But yeah, there's just so much great material with Thrawn, and I feel like they could, even just cherry picking things, still make such an interesting character for this live action world.
Yeah, if nothing, the fact that he is an antagonist who is competent,
yes,
and even at times brilliant, right, makes him very menacing.
Yeah,
in a way that often the Imperial villains tend to be bumbling a lot of the times.
Yeah. And I'm going to say, one of the only other Imperial villains I can think of who's not bumbling and an idiot is Moff Gideon. And so having both of them in the same world could be very interesting for sure. But Moff Gideon definitely seems very personally focused in a way that I think Thrawn never was. So, again, could be interesting. Riki, for folks who want to learn more about you or follow some more of your thoughts and stuff, what are best ways folks can keep up with what you're doing these days?
The best thing to do is to find me on Twitter at MTG Wikipedia, like the website Wikipedia, but with an R, and then MTG for Magic the Gathering. Although, I might be changing it soon. I don't know. I've been thinking about it.
Makes sense. Unfortunately, not as much Magic the Gathering in our lives these days as we would certainly like there to be. For you all listeners, we've thrown out a lot of ideas. We've thrown out a lot of theories. For the folks who hadn't known much about Thrawn, what's your take on him now? What do you think? Have we lit that fire of excitement? Do you end this going, okay, that sounds fun, but I don't really need him in the show? Would love to know your thoughts. Folks who have been long-term Thrawn geeks, what do you all think? Or even for the new people, what do you think about our different theories? How might he appear in the different shows or maybe upcoming movies? What's your take? Are we totally wrong? Go in a different direction. Let us know that. Also, as I said, we're going to record other primer episodes on Ashoka Tano and her story and how that's very tied into Bo-Katan and the story of Mandalore. And how the Mandalorians that we've met until now are quite different than the Mandalorian from the show, and how all that might play together. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, or email. Best way to find all those things is go to strandedpanda.com, click on Star Wars Universe, and you'll find all of our links right there. Also on there, you can find a lot of other great podcasts. My other podcast, Superhero Ethics, as well as PandaVision, which I've been on a number of times. Starting in December, we're going to be doing reviews of The Stand, the new CBS all-access limited series, and we're going to start with a discussion of the book in one episode, and then a discussion of the 90s movie series, miniseries, which is a very interesting bit of drama, and reminds you what TV miniseries were like before the age of Netflix and the good TV we have today. Interesting version of the story, but very different standards of TV. You can check out all that. You can also check out other great podcasts about the MCU, Star Trek universe, DC universe, all sorts of other great things, all there on the Stranded Panda Network. So, I'm going to have myself, Riki, Sarah could not be with us, everybody else involved. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Kenobi?
Art!
Jeff has spoken.